I am Sopon. I'm very pleased to be MC for today's launching event. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start the event. I would like to inform all participants that the webinar will be in English, but we have interpretation where you can switch to Khmer language if you like to. And also the webinar will be recorded. You may already receive the notification about this record. So now allow me to go through the agenda of today's launching briefly. As you can see on the screen, we'll start with the introduction session by me. It will be a quick introduction. And then we'll have the opening remark from Ms. Alisa Chaka, the resident representative of UNDP in Cambodia. After that, we will have introduction to the SDG Impact Standard presentation by Ms. Fabienne Michaud, the director of UNDP SDG Impact. And finally, we'll have Q&A session. And for this session, you are welcome to drop the question in the Q&A box below. Thank you. So as part of the introduction sessions as well, we will have a few poll questions for all participants just to break the ice and before we start the session. So you will have 30 seconds for each question, and then we will share with you the answer from all participants and also the correct answer. I hope you're ready. We can start the poll question now. So the first question is, what does the term sustainable mean? You can choose the one answer that you think is correct, and then we'll share with you the right answer later. Thank you. The time is up for the first question. I would like to share the result for the first question. Seems like a lot of participants choose the answer B, which is the correct answer. So sustainable means that a balance between meeting today's needs with those of the future. So we can continue to the next question. So globally, institutional investors manage over 100 trillion US dollar asset under management. What percentage of these can help plug the current SDG financing gap in emerging market? So there are 4 options. You can choose the one that you think is the correct answer. So the time is up for the second poll question. Let me share you the result. So we can see that a lot of participants choose answer C, followed by answer D and answer A. Which one is the correct answer? So the correct answer is D. So which means that a shift of only 3.7% of the total 100 trillion US dollar of asset held globally by institutional investors towards sustainable activity in developing countries would be sufficient to plug in the current SDG financing gap. Thank you. We can go on to the third poll question. The question is, which of the following is necessary as a target for sustainable or impact investment? So the time is up now for the last poll question. I can share you the result from participant. We can see that a lot of participants chose the last answer. Ambitious and rigorous goal, they contribute as much as possible to the SDG by 2030, optimal target, regenerative and striving. So while 2030 is a key goalpost, sustainable management practice will have far-reaching implications beyond Agenda 2030, which means that the last answer is the correct one. So thank you all participants for participating with us. I hope this is just like a ice-breaking session before we go into the real session. Now, without further delay, I would like to invite Ms. Alisa Chaka to do opening remark, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Soporn. Ms. Fabienne Michaud, Director of UNDP SDG Impact. Welcome, Fabienne, virtually to Cambodia. Devauti, also welcome to virtually to Cambodia. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to welcome you together with the UNDP Sustainable Finance Hub to the virtual launch of the SDG Impact Standards in Cambodia. I am glad to note that the participation of key ministries and private sector representatives, and look forward to working with you all to expand efforts for accelerating sustainable development in Cambodia and to make your valuable contributions more visible to the public. Why the emphasis on sustainability? The pandemic was taxing to all of us, but it also taught us as countries, as people, as societies, valuable lessons and exposed important blind spots that we did not see before. Science demonstrated the links between the pandemic and the current industrial and socio-political systems, causing the degradation of nature and social inequalities. The root cause of the COVID-19 pandemic was the transmission of a virus from animals to humans. The reasons are believed to be related to changes in land use and agricultural practices, in legal and illegal wildlife trade, deforestation, poverty, poor sanitation, and the lack of education and awareness that helped to create the optimal conditions for this disease to thrive and to become so harmful. The pandemic and subsequent lockdown have shown that the cost of these externalities has become too hefty to continue ignoring it. A green and inclusive recovery is therefore the sure path to a more resilient future without ignoring the informal sector and micro and small businesses and other people left behind. The role of the financial sector is critical in catalyzing these changes, namely by making impact investment the norm and not the ideal, and by providing capital for innovation and for achieving the SDGs. The business case for achieving the global goals is strong worldwide, but in Asia, it is particularly well placed to reap the collective benefits, as noted in the 2070 report on sustainable business opportunities in Asia, published by the Business Commission Initiative. Asia has sturdy, capable businesses with value chains involving millions of enterprises. Many Asian governments are willing and are able to shape market activity and invest in a way that achieves broad nation-building goals. For these reasons, more than 40% of the 12 trillion in business opportunities associated with the global goals around the world are here in Asia. Coming back to Cambodia, the investment and business landscape has changed. Prior to the pandemic, Cambodia achieved strong economic growth with an average GDP rate of 7% per annum over the last decade. But 2020 gave us another view. GDP growth rate fell to minus 3.1%, while poverty rate increased by almost 5 percentage points according to a study on the impact of COVID in Cambodia done by the Ministry of Economy and Finance and UNDP. Last year, economic growth returned slowly to a positive number. The government has a preliminary figure of 3% GDP growth in 2021 and has estimated that 5.6% and 6.7% will be achieved in 2022 and 2023 respectively, according to the Ministry of Economy and Finance. By sector, the government and other manufacturing sectors, along with construction, remain drivers of growth. They are followed by transportation, communication, trade, and hospitality sector. The private sector has driven growth and job creation in Cambodia's economy, the economy has a very interesting characteristic. It has fewer state-owned enterprises as compared to other neighboring countries, such as in Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And this is according to a report by Emerging Market Consulting. The private sector in Cambodia will increase in relevance in the near future. The UNDP Development Finance Assessment, updated in 2021, projected that the share of foreign direct investment and domestic private investment could increase from 11.4% and 8% of GDP respectively in 2022 to 13.7% and 10% of GDP in 2025. Private sector, let's not forget, employs about 88% of the total labor force, according to the latest Cambodia Socioeconomic Survey in 2019. In addition to creating employment opportunities and driving economic growth, private sector is the main source of fiscal revenue. This revenue allows the government to address various development challenges, including the provision of essential public goods and services. Most importantly, we see the expanded role of the private sector in promoting transformational changes and in supporting the acceleration of the Cambodia Sustainable Development Goals. Achieving the Cambodia Sustainable Development Goals, and by the way, they are 18, is a whole of society endeavor. It requires the partnership of the government, the private sector, civil society, and academia to make sure that the kingdom is on a strong development track that is inclusive, green, and thus resilient to any shock. The 2030 Development Agenda is, however, not a government agenda. It is everybody's business. The UN estimates that achieving the SDGs globally requires overcoming a critical financing gap of around 5 to 7 trillion per year. It recognizes that the private sector has a fundamental role to play if the world is to achieve these goals and to ensure economic growth and poverty reduction that does not come at the expense of environmental costs and social disparities and inequalities. The 2030 Agenda and the SDGs were adopted by leading private sector entities as a global framework to capture the benefits and possible trade-offs of sustainable development. This meant encouraging greater SDG-aligned investments from institutional investors and corporations, using the 2030 Agenda as a proactive roadmap for capital deployment, rather than exclusively a framework for retroactive and often public finance-focused assessment of impact. Given the private sector's significant role, integrating sustainability at the core of the businesses and aligning internal processes, practices, and decision-making is crucial for accelerating the achievement of the Cambodian SDGs. While Fabienne will present in a few minutes the SDG Impact Standards and their importance, I would like to highlight a few points. Investing responsibly is increasingly becoming relevant for investors who want to reap the benefits of rapidly declining costs and significant growth potentials in renewable energy generation, which are central to achieving a low carbon economy and ensuring business continuity as the pandemic and conflict wreak havoc on oil markets. Enterprises seeking investment can get a head start by adopting global independent management standards, such as the SDG Impact Standards for enterprises. These standards guide enterprises to make decisions that integrate sustainability throughout their operations. Having this common language of sustainability management that the SDG Impact Standards offer helps both the investee and the investor not only to do good business, but also to streamline due diligence in day-to-day management, ensuring that both parties are contributing to the well-being and prosperity of the society. Let's not forget that the SDGs and Agenda 2030 is nothing else than well-being and prosperity of the society. When both parties are speaking the same language on how they manage the impact they have on their communities and their surrounding environment, it makes it easier to do business, be innovative, and work towards a resilient business and investment model that does good while also making profit. At UNDP Cambodia, we promote and engage in private sector partnerships for achieving the SDGs in various forms. These vary from building platforms and coalitions to facilitate SDG-aligned investment. The Cambodia Sdg Investment Map is under development with technical support from the UNDP Sustainable Finance Hub, SDG Impact. The map is a tool that generates country-specific data and insights to inform private investors, whether funds, financial institutions, corporations, foundations, and the like, on economically viable investment opportunities and business models that also advance sustainable development and accelerate the achievement of the Cambodia SDGs. UNDP also is supporting the Royal Government of Cambodia on the first sovereign bond issuance in Khmer Reals in 2022, and is elaborating a working plan with the Ministry of Economy and Finance to move towards green financing mechanism, such as, for example, green or SDG bonds. We are also advocating on key development issues, such as climate action and nature-based solutions, and we are supporting relevant innovation to increase trade competitiveness amid global calls for stronger climate commitments and respect of human rights and well-being. We are also involved in promoting socially and environmentally responsible business models for access to clean energy, energy efficiency, and circular economy. Promoting innovative solutions to social and environmental challenges is also on the agenda. Notably, we are fostering sustainable transport, micro to small and medium enterprises digital transformation for business continuity with the Ministry of Commerce and Khmer Enterprise. We are promoting inclusion of persons with disability and the elderly and digital cash transfers for poor households as social networks. Expanding financing options for women via a credit guarantee mechanism was recently launched with the Credit Guarantee Corporation of Cambodia. In closing, I would like to emphasize that sustainable development is the core focus of UNDP. UNDP strongly believes that development must balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability, and that progress should be for all, leaving no one behind. This is probably the key lesson that the pandemic has also taught us. The ambition of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development cannot be achieved solo or in silos. I am therefore encouraged by the diverse participation in this event and would like to call for a collective action to accelerate the progress towards the SDGs in Cambodia. UNDP stands ready to accompany this effort as needed. You can count with us. Wishing you a good continuation and a fruitful deliberations. I thank you for your attention. Over to you, Sopon.
Thank you so much, Alisa, for your meaningful opening remark. And I also would like to remind all participants that if you have questions, please drop in the Q&A box below. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Fabienne Michaud to do the presentation on SDG Impact Standard, please.
Thank you, and Safwan and Alistair for those amazing opening comments. Very, very inspiring. I feel like my work is done. I don't want to do anything that interrupts that message. So so maybe I should leave now. So I'll just pull up my presentation. Just give me a tick. There we go. Oh, oops, I'll go back. So today we're really going to focus on the SDG Impact Standards, which is part of the work that the SDG Impact Initiative is undertaking. And as Devahuti has already put in the chat, we are finalising work on the Cambodia Investor Map, which will be released in the coming months via the investor platform. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Temasek Trust, which has made a lot of our work in the ASEAN region, particularly around the maps and supporting the driving of awareness and adoption of the SDG standards around the region, and thank them for their continued support. So I think before we get started, and Alisa actually talked about some of these things, but I think it's really important to level set around language and how terms are used and how we are using the terms when we talk about things like sustainability and impact and ESG, because they're terms that mean very different things to different people. So so as came out in the poll, you know, sustainability to us is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's sustainability encompasses three aspects of well-being: environmental, economic, and social aspects. That is not, there's a lot of overlap, but that is not the same thing as thinking about the environmental, social, and governance issues that impact enterprise value. And because we have a number of externalities in our core financial and economic system, things that aren't included in that system, in that net, can cause there to be differences between, you know, what I would call true sustainability, where we're focused on the impacts that organisations and investments have on people and planet, versus the environmental, social and governance issues that today we expect will impact financial performance of organisations. And I think that's a really important distinction, because when we look at some of the activity and the quantum of activity that is now labelled as either ESG or sustainable, particularly from investment markets, the numbers are enormous, but we're not seeing the progress in terms of sustainable development and achievement of the SDGs. So there is a disconnect between the labelling of activities and investments as being sustainable or supporting ESG and achieving real impacts on the ground for people and planet. And that's one of the things that we've really tried to focus on with the standards. I think, you know, importantly, when we think about ESG, ESG integration in particular is really a practice that risk management practice and approach that has developed to focus on how those factors can impact enterprise or portfolio value. As I'll talk about in a little while about some of the mega trends that are really driving the change and shift towards sustainability being a much more significant issue for the private sector, I think it's also interesting that that some of the determination of what those factors are that we expect will impact future financial performance are probably anchored by past experience, not necessarily informed by those megatrends and how things are changing. So in some respects, really trying to think about sustainability through a financial materiality lens is probably systematically underestimating future financial risks, and of course missing out on some of those important impacts on people and planet. So in terms of achieving sustainability, What we've been focusing on is the need for organisations to really integrate sustainability in the SDGs into their business and investment purpose and management practices. So really managing for impact. And when we use the term impact, what we're talking about are the economic, social, and environmental changes that are experienced by people and planet, which are caused by an organisation or investors' actions and decisions, through their direct operations, but also through their supply and value chains, their business relationships and products and services. And importantly, when we're talking about impact, we want organisations focusing on the most material impacts, whether they're positive or negative. And importantly, I think focusing on the negative, because, I think we're, as a system, tend to be quite, biased towards focusing on positive things and perhaps not so much on negative things. And they can be intended or unintended and direct or indirect. And I think one of the important things and embedded in the framework of the SDGs is that a lot of these impacts can be interdependent across different aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a need to think about things holistically to understand what the consequences of impacts on one target might be in terms of its impact on other targets, and inaction on some targets that may get in the way of achieving the goals on other targets as well. So that's just a bit of background to put in context the language and the use of language. I think one of the other things I really wanted to talk about was, and Alyssa did talk to this, is the purpose of the standards and what they actually focus on. Sustainability is a very crowded landscape at the moment. There's a lot of standards and frameworks and principles and tools that are being developed, but overwhelmingly, a lot of the focus is on the external reporting standards. Ones that come to mind are obviously the global debate around the development of the International Sustainability Standards Board under IFRS, and the bringing together under that banner of SASB Integrated Reporting Framework. There's the TCFD framework for climate. There's now talk of a TCND for nature and as well, and GRI. So these are the ones that...
Apologies
yes.
for interrupting, but are you moving the slides? I mean, we can't see.
Oh, no, I'm still at the start. That's okay. I'm not.
Okay, great.
I will move the slides when I move on to them. And this came up on a panel that we were talking about earlier today, and I thought it was interesting, was firstly, all of those standards are external reporting standards. They're not internal management standards. And all bar GRI focus on enterprise value, not on the impacts that the organisations are having on people and planet. So when we're talking about the SDG Impact Standards, we're very focused on integrating sustainability into how organisations make decisions and manage their internal practices. External reporting is really important. It's necessary, but in our view, it's not sufficient to drive the change at the pace we need it to actually drive the outcomes that we need. So, that's my background and long talk before I actually start talking to the slides, which I'll start doing now. So, all decisions that we make impact people and planet. Organisations make lots of decisions that impact people and planet, whether we measure them or not. And really what we're trying to do with the standards is bring that to the fore, make it more visible, make the decision-making around those impacts more conscious, so that we can optimise impact and collectively as a system move towards having a more positive and net positive impact on sustainable development and achievement of the SDGs. Sustainability is becoming, in our view, a major disruptor for businesses and investors, and it's hard to ignore now. But it's also an opportunity to adapt to the potential impacts of global megatrends to create resilient, sustainable value into the future. And when I talk about megatrends, there's a number of them that are directly linked to the need to start thinking more sustainably to actually drive more resilient and sustainable business performance in the future. So things like climate change, obviously, biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, population growth and demographic shifts such as ageing and urbanisation. And Alisar talked earlier about, the pandemic and some of that intersection and clashing of human activity into natural habitats, the digital revolution and the consequences for the future of work, rising wealth inequality, and social and geopolitical instability. We're experiencing all of those things now. So that really means that what we've been able to get away with, largely, not for everybody and not universally, but what we've been able to get away with to now is not going to be something that's going to stand us in good stead in the future. And we need to really change the way we think about creating value from a private sector perspective to contribute to a more sustainable world and actually optimise all of our ability to have a more prosperous future. So these megatrends are affecting societies and businesses in unprecedented ways and on a scale we haven't experienced before. And I've got some statistics here at a global level that just, I think, really paint that picture and really highlight that these sustainability aspects, social, environmental and economic aspects of well-being are really colliding and impacting increasingly the ability of organisations to sustain their financial performance. So according to the World Economic Forum, COVID-19 and climate action failure are the two most likely long-term risks to the world economy. So I think that's pretty amazing that the World Economic Forum counts what ostensibly started as a health crisis and an environmental crisis as the two most likely things that are going to impact negatively on the world economy. And climate action failure is listed as the most likely and most impactful long-term risk to the world economy. The latest IPCC report gave a stark warning that heat is causing more deaths, more destruction of biodiversity and warming the oceans. And many of these effects could become irreversible without action. The physical damage from climate change alone is estimated between 10 to 20% of global GDP by the end of the century, or $8 to $17 trillion a year. In lost GDP from physical damage of climate change alone. So these are pretty big numbers in terms of, we've spent a long time in economic theory arguing that, rising tides lift all boats. And, these are some risks now that are really, potentially going to suck us all down the plug hole as these things come through if we can't actually take action to arrest them. On the biodiversity side, more than 50% of global GDP depends on high-functioning biodiversity and ecosystem services, and yet we're experiencing biodiversity loss at quite an alarming and accelerating pace, and climate change will only hasten that further. The very real and destructive effects of climate change have also been compounded by the devastating effects of COVID-19 and the health, social and economic impacts of the ongoing global pandemic have set back the global sustainable development agenda by at least a decade, so that if we remain on our current trajectory from here, it's likely to be the end of the century before we achieve the SDGs. And Alisar was talking about the financing gap earlier for the SDGs, the OECD has estimated that the annual SDG financing gap has increased to 3.7 trillion US per year from 2.5 trillion before the pandemic. And of course, right now, we're also experiencing and being reminded by the current situation with Ukraine and Russia that the growing undercurrent of global geopolitical instability carries with it very real, intertwined and increasingly tangible social, economic and environmental costs and risks for us all. There's obviously, significant issues that many countries are dealing with around food security and energy security as a result, not to mention the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and the loss of life. But it's also having broader impacts. If we look at the current economic crisis in Sri Lanka, they've really been hit on all fronts in terms of the impact of loss of tourism from both Russia and Ukraine were big contributors there. So perfect storm for Sri Lanka, where those geopolitical, social and health issues have translated into a massive economic crisis. So with that, it's good to become more sustainable. Now we're going to talk about the standards. So we're not yet on a sustainable path. A lot of our view is that the approaches that are being used now aren't sufficient to actually get us to where we need to get to. And we need a transformational shift in mindset and how we operate to put us on the right trajectory to achieve our sustainable development goals and achieve a more sustainable and resilient and more inclusive future for all. So to actually drive that sustainable future, we need a much stronger focus on sustainable development and the SDGs. And, in Cambodia, there is a very strong focus on the SDGs and a lot of work going into drive sustainable development domestically. But, notwithstanding significant progress, there's still a lot of challenges. And achieving the SDGs does require collaboration and partnership across all sectors, public and private. And the private sector has a really big role to play. And, again, Alisar talked about just the massive contribution that the private sector makes in Cambodia and, really looking for ways to drive that change and make sustainability core to how businesses create value is key to creating that future. So again, in terms of the standards, what we've tried to do, there's around sustainable finance, there tends to be a focus on the niche activities and on filling that financing gap that we talked about before, the 3.7 trillion. But we've taken a much more holistic view that what we really need is 100% of capital to operate more responsibly and sustainably. So we need to manage all capital so that we're avoiding or significantly reducing negative impacts and creating things that benefit society. And if we don't do that, then we'll never achieve true sustainability and sustainable development, because we're just seeding tomorrow's problems that will need gaps, will need fills in the future. So we want all capital to operate more sustainably and responsibly, but we need a portion of the world's total capital to be much more targeted to filling that SDG financing gap and achieving the sustainable development goals. And there, given that oftentimes those gaps exist because of market failures, that's where we really need to see also that strong partnership and collaborative approach to bring capital from across the system together and to look for opportunities to innovate and do things differently. So it's not, it's not the private sector's role to, make a loss and fill holes that that don't make sense, you know, from a commercial perspective, but there is a lot of opportunity for the private sector to work more closely in public-private partnerships and with different providers of capital across the system to be part of creating solutions that help to fill those gaps and target those underserved stakeholders that are being left behind. So to put the world on a more sustainable and equitable path and achieve the SDGs, what we've really targeted with the standards is trying to drive a transformational shift in mindset around management decision making. So our mission is to guide businesses and investors to integrate sustainability and the SDGs into the core of management systems and decision making, and direct capital to where it can make the most difference to people and planet. So the standards really talk to that first part of the mission. The investor maps that we're creating for different markets is really one of the ways that we're helping to provide signposts for businesses and investors to identify the areas where capital can be directed in a way that will be aligned and help to achieve the SDGs in different contexts and country settings. Importantly, with the maps, one of the things that we're now doing is also identifying not only current investment opportunities, but white spaces where we think if there was more policy priority and emphasis, that there could be additional and significant impact by crowding in the private sector to finance some of those potential opportunities. So within SDG Impact, we have a focus on managing for impact and putting sustainability in the SDGs at the core of management systems and decision making. And there what we're doing is we've created the SDG Impact Standards, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. We're creating the SDG Impact Assurance and Seal, which is based on the standards, and I'll talk about how that relates and is designed in a minute too. And we're also focusing on training and education. So we've already released an online course which we developed in conjunction with Duke University on Coursera, which gives a really good foundational knowledge in impact measurement and management that is a really good primer for organisations that are looking to potentially adopt the standards. On the data and insight side, as I talked about before, we're developing our SDG Investor Maps that identify investment opportunity areas where there's the intersection between policy priority and ability for the private sector to participate and SDG need. And we've developed now, I think, close to 20 maps. We've got several coming online over the next few months, and they're all loaded onto what we call our SDG Investor platform and easily searchable from the platform. So the SDG Impact Standards, we've really designed to be the North Star, and here it's actually the moon in my picture. So what we felt was we really needed to provide context on where we're heading to, and give people direction of travel, so that you know, we could really in our line of sight say this is where we need to get to make our system more sustainable and give us a shot at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So the standards are quite aspirational and unapologetically so, because really when we look at where we are today, you know, we're not on a sustainable path and we're not on track to achieve the SDGs. So what we wanted to do was really say, well, this is what we think practice looks like and what the financial system looks like to put us on that sustainable track. Obviously, we recognise that you know, organisations aren't there yet. So the assurance system that we're designing is based on the standards, but the minimum evidence requirements are set at a lower level. And what we've done with the assurance framework is basically looking to strike the right balance in terms of being, being set at a high bar, but not completely unattainable bar. And also embed into the assurance framework a requirement to demonstrate continuous improvement over time that shows that organisations are improving their practices, sustainability practices over time in line with the best practice indicators that are set out in the SDG Impact Standards. So the reason for this visual is because many years ago on a management course, we had an astronaut come and talk to us about his life and how much time he spends on email versus flying to the moon. But he actually talked about the fact that when when the shuttle is on the way to the moon, it's actually only on course 3% of the time. The other 97% of the time, it's course correcting. And it's able to course correct fairly easily because it can look out the window and say, I'm going to the moon and correct its course. So, in context of the standards, that's what we've really tried to do with the standards, is that the standards are the moon. And as you're implementing the standards either on a self-assessment basis or getting an assurer in to provide that independent validation, you're able to course correct over time in terms of moving towards best practice in line with those standards. So to date, we've developed 4 sets of standards, 3 sets of standards under the SDG Impact banner, so for private sector participants. So the 3 sets of standards are for enterprises, bond issuers and private equity funds. And we were really actually very happy and proud to collaborate with OECD on the 4th set of standards, which are the OECD UNDP Impact Standards for Financing Sustainable Development. And the reason we were really happy about that is that, as I was talking about before, with that need to actually really connect capital across the system, bringing in donor capital from governments under the OECD standards is one of those areas of being able to connect development capital and private capital together by creating, within the family of standards, the same language and approach to do that. And I think a personal goal of mine is really, with the work that we've been doing with the standards, is really to drive convergence and bring a lot of the things that are in the net together and make it easier for people to navigate their way around what many people call the alphabet soup of the standards, frameworks and tools in this space. And I think that the bringing together of UNDP and OECD, that's a fairly unassailable strength in terms of covering most of the world, to drive this forward in a way that is complementary and interoperable across the system. And I think that's a really important goal we should all have in terms of trying to drive this forward. So, as I said before, the standards are internal management decision-making standards. They're not reporting standards and they're not performance standards. This is all about decision-making and how organisations make decisions. Much more similar in terms of what they're trying to achieve and how they're designed to, say, ISO standards than to external reporting standards. So we focus on the foundations being operating sustainably and contributing positively to sustainable development and the SDGs, and that can't be achieved without demonstrating respect for planetary boundaries, human rights and other responsible business practices, and that it's realised through effective impact management and decision making. And that core is driven through the practice indicators under the 4 themes of strategy, management approach, transparency and governance. Then, really our view is that if we can help organisations design their internal management practices to incorporate and embed and integrate sustainability, this will leave them in a much better position to actually report out to stakeholders, under existing requirements, but future requirements as well. And to do that from one source of truth, because I actually think for organisations at the moment, oftentimes there's an increasing number of demands to report out externally, and these are done sometimes in isolation and not necessarily from the same source of truth. So it's inefficient and it's high risk for organisations because it doesn't necessarily tie up. So this slide tries to give I guess a visual representative of where the standards fit in that very busy landscape. So we have a number of principles of practice that have been developed. For private equity, the operating principles for impact management stand out. The UNEP principles for responsible banking and positive impact finance. On the investment side, principles for responsible investment, although PRI actually has as its core more of a focus on financially material factors that impact investment value than on impacts on society, and also the characteristics of the impact investor. On the enterprise side too, the UN Global Compact also released a set of principles for integrating the SDGs and sustainability into into treasury practices, and those were taken into account too. So with the development of our standards, what we tried to do was actually draw on everything that was already available around those principles, so that the standards of practice, go to that next level in terms of implementation, but are consistent with any or all of those principles of practice. So again, really trying to drive that convergence across the system. At the core of the standards is obviously the Sustainable Development Goals and the associated targets in particular. But we don't dictate, which metrics to use. What we do with the standards is really set out a decision-making framework for organisations to select which metrics make the most sense, and also the impact management projects, 5 dimensions of impact and ABCs as a, I guess, nomenclature for talking about and categorizing impacts. Importantly too, within the standards, there are some important frameworks that are referenced and core to the standards. So they're the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, the UN Women Empowerment Principles, the ILO principles. So all of these have been taken into account, in the development of the standards. And then off to the right-hand side is where we see a lot of activity and what I talked about before. So there's a lot of work going on around external reporting and benchmarking. And many of these organisations, we have regular contact with and are working with. We actually partnering with Social Value International on developing our training materials. They have 8 principles and standards around measuring what matters and stakeholder engagement. Through our collaboration, they've actually, as they're refining and revising and updating their principles and standards, they've actually made changes to bring them closer to the SDG Impact Standards. We have regular contact with Capitals Coalition. Again, that's one of the frameworks that we think is most complementary, particularly for the enterprise standards, that goes to another layer of detail that would help organisations implement this within their organisations. We worked with the World Benchmarking Alliance when they were developing one of their latest benchmarks, and integrated elements of the SDG Impact Standards there to make them more complementary and interoperable. and you know, there are other examples as well. Obviously, the collaboration with OECD as well stands out there as well. So our view is that, you know, collectively, the standards have the potential to drive change across the economic system, obviously by being adopted by the primary users, but also being used by investors to integrate into their investment guidelines and criteria, by analysts and advisors who are helping organisations embed sustainability practices, and also government and policymakers as well. The standards, based on feedback, we have organised the standards for each set of standards around 12 enterprise fund or issuer actions. And these are the actions. So, so really, in terms of what we're trying to achieve, you can see when you look at these that it's very much around the decision-making processes. We don't expect organisations to have perfect data. In fact, we expect that, you know, just as with all other business decisions, we're dealing with imperfect data, but the standards are really providing that framework to help guide how much information is needed to make, you know, to make the best decisions, and what to do when you don't have all the data, and how to align the internal practices and systems to incentivise and support optimising impact. So here with the enterprise actions, the first 5 actions relate to strategy. So, you know, the first business action around committing to operating sustainably and making a positive contribution to the SDGs is really about setting the foundation for how the enterprise will create value in the future. So, you know, really transforming from sustainability being an add-on to what business gets done to being the filter for how all business is done. The second business action around understanding the sustainability context and mapping current and future potential material impacts is really important. And this is where I think there's a really strong opportunity to think more expansively around what you know, what the context and opportunities look like for the organisation going forward. So here we really want to ensure that the enterprise can identify and focus on the impacts that matter most, not necessarily only within its current footprint, but also thinking towards the future in terms of where some of the blind spots and gaps may be for opportunities to have more impact and to better manage emerging sustainability risks in the future. The third business action then really takes, you know, takes what comes out of the first and second actions to integrate sustainability and the SDGs into the organisation's purpose and strategy, and to really clarify the enterprise's impact intentions and align those to its purpose and strategy accordingly. And then in 4, setting goals and targets in line with that now integrated purpose and strategy. And importantly, with the goal setting, you know, thinking about it from the perspective of the rate of change and, you know, what the ambitious goals relative to where the organisation's current performance is and the thresholds, for instance, as set by the SDGs. And then importantly, you know, throughout the standards, but here in business actions 5 and 9, embedding feedback loops and continuous improvements so that we can keep moving forward and creating more momentum towards impact over time. The business actions 6 to 9 focus on the management approach, so really translating the strategy into the organisation's operations to, you know, first align the culture, structure and skills within the organisation with the purpose and strategy, develop the impact measurement and management framework to manage impact, and then put that into action and integrate it into decision making. Business Action 10 focuses on disclosure of practice and performance, and really with a view to providing external stakeholders who use that information with what they need to make more informed decisions. And then importantly, 11 and 12 focus on governance. So, holding the enterprise to account for its impact, intentions and performance, and setting the tone from the top. So with the standards, what we really found was that there's a lot of focus around the management approach and transparency. So measuring impact and managing impact. There was where we found significant gaps were in the strategy and governance, which we think were important gaps to fill to really deal with some of the shortcomings of current approaches that are undermining action towards the achievement of the SDGs. So using the SDG Impact Standards, our view is that in the first instance, organisations can obviously, work with the standards. We have developed self-assessment tools and Excel tools so that organisations can, work through their current practices against the practice indicators in the standards, and also prioritise where, early, easy wins, or where there's opportunity to actually drive improvements. We think that performing that gap analysis and internal development plans is something, and playing with the standards is something that would be a precursor to then moving over time towards having those practices externally assured, under the assurance framework that's currently being developed. So this slide is just talking about that pathway again. The standards are gaining momentum. We're seeing early adoption of the standards in different contexts. This is just a few different examples. In Malaysia, we that's a royal we, because it was Devahuti that did all the work, so I can't claim credit, but we had a working group of enterprises that self-selected out of one of our UNDP accelerator programs, and working with us to go to that next step at looking to implement the SDG Impact Standards within their businesses. Interestingly, in Japan, R&I, which is the large domestic credit rating agency in Japan, picked up the standards and used them to structure an assessment they were asked to do on the City of Kobe's 2025 vision for achieving the SDGs. And we've also seen a couple of bond issues in the region using the standards. We've just also done 3 days with a management team in a chicken producer in the Nordic region who are interested in using the standards. And we have a number of other organisations that are talking to us about driving adoption. This just talks a little bit about the supporting materials. So each set of standards is supported by some additional guidance notes that also highlights some of the resources. As I talked about in the centre there, there is a self-assessment tool that organisations can use to perform a gap analysis and develop their own internal development plans. This self-assessment tool will form the basis to feed into the assurance system for the information that will go to assurers. We're trying to make that the whole process as streamlined as possible, so it's as efficient as possible. There is a glossary that supports the standards, which is very useful to read. And over to the right-hand side, there's the details for for organisations that would like to undertake the impact measurement and management for the SDGs course, the free online Coursera course, which was launched in September last year and has already got more than 8,000 registrants from around the world, and we're getting overwhelmingly positive feedback from people that have completed the course. We're also in the process of finalising our training materials for a Train the Trainer program that will train trainers internally and external to UNDP to train users and assurers around the SDG Impact Standards. That's just the course again, and I might finish there and hand back to Siobhan. Thank you.
Thanks, Fab. I'll come in at this point. You know, we have some interesting discussion happening in the chat box, and also, you know, a couple of questions that have come up. So before I, you know, sort of ask Fab or Alyssa to address some of those questions, I just wanted to reiterate that all the information, especially around resources that Fab mentioned in her presentation, are publicly available. We will be sharing those links in a follow-up email with all the participants who have registered for the webinar. And specifically, you know, because I do see a lot of questions coming in about you know, how do we build our capacities, or, you know, where do we look at courses that can help individuals and enterprises build their capacities on impact management and measurement. There is this great course that we developed with the University of Duke. I just shared the link in the chat box. It's free unless you want a certificate, in which case you'll have to pay a small amount. But it has great content. We've already seen fantastic uptake around the globe, and especially from the ASEAN as well. You know, a lot of, we've received great feedback on, you know, how companies and individuals have been able to learn a lot from this. So please take this course, you know, and we would love some feedback if you have any. So coming to questions, Fab, you know, there is this one interesting one from Hassan. And he asks that the 6 principles for responsible investment offer a menu of possible actions for incorporating ESG issues into investment practices, which is great. But the question really is, what concrete work is currently being done at UNDP or, you know, at a policy level or by other serious institutions to also incorporate ESG issues into business practices? And then there is another follow-up question that how can businesses incorporate important aspects of well-being like equality, natural capital preservation, life satisfaction, or even happiness into their measures of success and go beyond just the measurement of financial profits?
Okay, so I might get you to repeat the second bit after I answer the first bit, because I'm sure it's going to just exit my brain. So I guess in terms of you know, work that's being undertaken across the system, there's a lot of really good work underway. I think what's really important is you know, different perspectives. So, you know, the enterprise value perspective and the impact on people and planet perspective are both valid perspectives. The thing that I think is most, you know, damaging at the moment is that there's often a conflation of approaches and confusion about what different frameworks and standards are doing. So I think the first thing I would say is it's really important to look at each framework and determine whether or not it's actually fit for purpose for what you're trying to do, because a lot of them do focus on that financial materiality aspect, and there is a gap. You know, we have a financial system that still has a lot of externalities created by that system where, you know, organisations and the economic system aren't held to account for in particular social you know, outcomes and also outcomes on future generations. So you know, first, you know, really focusing on that difference is really important. On the investor side, you know, as I said earlier, PRI, the 6 principles of PRI are actually more focused on the ESG integration and financial materiality aspect. PRI are doing a lot of work at the moment around additional work around SDGs and contribution to SDGs, but the 6 PRI principles are more focused on financial materiality. There is a group called the GISD, which is the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, which is a group of global institutional investors convened under UNDP. They are doing a lot of work around identifying metrics and issues relevant at a sector level. So we actually worked with and contributed to the development of the overarching sort of framework for incorporating sustainable development into investment decision making that DESA or that the GISD produced. And if you look at that, it's a one page on a grid. You'll see a lot of overlaps in that with the standards, but behind that, they're systematically working through different sectors and providing support to investors on metrics that they think are helpful to drive forward sustainable development on a sector basis. So, if you Google GISD, again, these are all free public goods and available for anybody to look up. On the enterprise side, I think that the most complementary framework to the SDG Impact Standards, and that we actually, in designing the standards, didn't look to replicate because, why replicate the good work of others that is already there? Our view has been to really raise that up and actually provide more visibility around that, is the work of the Capitals Coalition. So the Capitals Coalition have 2 protocols, the Natural Capital Protocol and the Human and Social Capital Protocol. And they set out within those protocols very well structured ways that are consistent with the standards to embed both impact and dependency management within management systems. The other framework that really is helpful in terms of implementing the standards, particularly around determining what impacts matter and stakeholder involvement in the decision-making process, are the principles and standards of Social Value International. So, those are the things that I think really stand out. The other thing that we're part of and have been part of for quite some time, and is actually going through a bit of a regeneration, and given that the IMP itself has, the Impact Management Project has come to the end of its life, is what is now the Impact Management Platform. So the Impact Management Project had what it called the structured network of global standard setters that basically for the last 3 to 4 years have been meeting regularly and working together to help drive convergence across standard setting bodies. So that includes OECD, UNEP-FI, UNGC, World Benchmarking Alliance, SASB, the IIRC. I'm going to be leaving out others, but there are others. but a group of organisations, and we do meet and try and actually drive convergence. The other important aspects is with the external reporting emphasis underway, with the development of the ISSB, which is bringing together SASB and the IIRC and IFRS, and more recently an MOU with GRI to actually ensure interoperability between that enterprise value perspective and the impacts on people and planet perspective. UNDP, as well as other UN entities and other multilaterals, are involved in that process as well through a multi-stakeholder advisory group that will be informing that development process. Then at a UNDP level, I think one of the other important aspects is obviously we have a lot of engagement and opportunities to engage at a policy level, both at a global level and domestically and nationally through our country offices. And at the global level, UNDP is the secretariat for the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. So, you know, our team interacts pretty regularly with Marcos Mancini, who is effectively the core contact person who drives the secretariat for that function. And we were also involved in the G7 Impact Task Force groups too that reported out recently. So, you know, we're really looking for all of those opportunities to drive convergence, you know, amongst standard setters, but also support the work we're doing in helping the private sector adopt more sustainable practices by being actively involved in the policy dialogue that can help to create the enabling environment and set, you know, the incentives at the right level to bring more organisations into that net. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Fab. And I wonder, Alyssa, if you would also like to react to this, because specifically there is also this question around, you know, how can businesses incorporate important aspects of well-being like equality, natural capital preservation, themes that you also addressed, you know, in your opening remarks. So any comments from you would also be very insightful.
You're on mute.
Yes, I fixed it. I was responding, you know, in the chat, but I will do it very quickly now to leave some, and I'll put more details. Colleagues, we need to really think that this is not charity. This is not values only. This is business. Here we're taking business decisions to optimize profits and to reduce enterprise and financial risks. So here we're not talking only about values and principles and being nice and wanting to live together in peace and harmony forever, right? We're taking business, we're talking dollars. And here there are certain decisions when we do business, trade-offs, but also, you know, benefits, you know, that we need to reap as soon as possible so that we can position the market to be competitive regionally, sub-regionally. Let's be very frank, colleagues. Cambodia is in a very dynamic sub-region, right? Cambodia cannot compete with Vietnam, cannot compete with Laos, cannot compete with Thailand using business as usual. Cambodia needs to find a different way of doing business, different niches that we're positioning, and different, you know, markets where it can really, you know, have a head start. Let's take an example. Europe buys from Cambodia every year for $1 billion, right? However, we know that the market of Europe are very exigent, and the clients in Europe are very exigent. In 3 to 4 years, they will stop buying anything that will not come from a green value chain. I'm not now talking about one business. We're talking about the whole value chain. So this great country, this great kingdom of Cambodia, which has lots of resources, lots of ideas, lots of initiatives, how will it position itself? And particularly that Cambodia will be graduating to middle income country in the very near future, I hope, right? In 2021, we got a kiddos, you know, to graduate from LDCs. We will be reviewed another time in 2024, which means in 2 years, less than 2 years, right? So we need to put already, you know, the mechanisms to be able to graduate without having any significant impacts, because we're losing the trade tariffs, preferential trade tariffs, and that we are losing the money coming from donors. Donors will shift their attention to poorer countries and to countries in crisis, as we're seeing now. So how can Cambodia gear itself as a country, as a state, but also as a private sector, which is a vibrant actor, you know, for development in the country? And this is what we're trying to support with these standards. As Fabienne has said, these are not standard to report. Yeah, you don't want to report, don't report, right? These are not standards, these are not principles. These are good practices, meaning that if you adopt them, you will enhance your own business and you will prepare yourself for the future. Cambodia has, everybody is calling for decarbonization of the economies. And this is, by the way, going quickly, not because, ethical reasons, just because, like the oil market, is going crazy. Everything is going, very expensive. So the businesses are smart. They look to ways to cut down on their costs and to optimize their profits. And if carbonization is the solution, they will need to do it. But to do this, there should be, a whole change of chip in the way we do business. So business as usual is not feasible. And this is what we are inviting you to look to these standards. And I noted a question. These standards are not sector specific. These talk about the important decisions, management decisions that you need to take in an enterprise, and you adapt them to your own context, you adapt them to your own sectors. And I'm talking under the control of Fabienne and Devwati, who are the experts. So this is, what we are trying to tell you. The work and the contribution of the private sector is invisible in Cambodia in terms of contribution to development. Everybody thinks of the private sector, they are reaping benefits, they are taking the resources of the country, they are harming the country. Is it true? Yes, some. Is it not true? Yes, it's not true, because there are lots of very, young entrepreneurs, who have seen, they're smart enough to have seen the importance of sustainability, either for ethical reasons and they want to do it, or, for pure business reasons, which makes sense. I always refer to these, reports. There is the Business Commission initiative that was created, in 2017, 18, I think 19, where, the business community has thought together and determined, business opportunities based on the SDGs, right? And they said that there are $12 trillion out there in market serving the base of the pyramid, that are not untapped to. Everybody's running to the upper period, the period of the pyramid. So this is, a market that will serve the poor, but will make lots of profits for the people who see the opportunity first and make it first. And there are lots of examples of inclusive business models, because I saw also questions about that, where, I think they brought from Bangladesh to Mexico when I was working in Latin America, a model of doing cataract surgeries, which cost $1. They have done something, with their input, with their system, with the size of the business, right? That it is still profitable if they do it for $1 to serve the poor. And this is lots of money going, and there are lots of examples, and UNDP has lots of examples on this. You can log to Business Call for Action. It's a platform also for the private sector that's UNDP, is managing at the, or is facilitating at the global level. But I won't go to the details. If I put more details about what we are doing in terms of policy in Cambodia specifically, because Fabienne has spoken about our work, globally with the G20, Secretariat for, Financing and Development. But if there is anything, I leave it with you. These are values, yes, but this is also money. This is green, colleagues. And you need really, I think, the business follows green, whether in the private sector in terms of manufacture and transformation, or the private sector as financing institutions. So over to you, and sorry for being too long.
And so I think that was absolutely fantastic. But I think you also highlighted a really important aspect that, a lot of the focus, particularly when we look at how this has, sort of come into decision-making through ESG integration, which is basically a financial risk management tool. But because of all of the mega trends that we're facing, there's an enormous opportunity cost of not identifying the opportunities for growth and for new business models to actually, lean into those challenges and trends. So, the standards have really tried to actually balance the risk and opportunity aspects, and not just focus on risk, where I think, you know, too much is left on the table in terms of preparing businesses for a more successful future.
And if you allow me, Fabienne, there are certain decisions that will be too late to take them later. The train will have left the station. So also, you know, it is the opportunity cost of not making these decisions.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great thought for us to go away with, that, you know, the train will have left the station before we start realizing the importance of these decisions. But I do want to turn to a participant who had raised their hands, Ratna Owen. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but could you please come in and ask your question? Rani, maybe we'll have to unmute them.
I already unmute, ask him, but it does not respond.
Okay. Because we are at the top of the hour, so all right, that's great, Ratna. Thank you. I think one of the things that you know, the last one of the questions that you know, we still have. But I think both Fab and you know, Alisar have responded to it. The question was around, you know, that there are a lot of things. Fab, you also pointed to the fact that, you know, the market is very overcrowded with frameworks. So a lot of projects trying to do this and that here and there. But at the end of it, you know, we are barely able to scratch the surface and not really address the deep roots of the problem, and something that we hope to correct with the wide scale adoption of our standards. So thank you so much, colleagues. We will be sharing our resources. I think this has been a fantastic, you know, conversation to begin with. It's our first public webinar for Cambodia, but this is a market that we are looking at with great interest, and hope to collaborate with the private sector stakeholders and other collaborators to take this journey forward on the adoption and scale up of the standards. Please do write to us with any questions, with any plans that you may have on how you want to look at the standards, customizing it for your context, etc. We'll be very, very happy to have a chat with you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Very good evening.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thanks to the audience. Bye-bye.